Hi, I'm Liz Gulliver. I'm one of the co-founders of Kunik, and I'm joined here with Kate Snowise, one of our incredible Kunik experts, who you guys are about to hear from in a minute. But first, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here today. I don't know where you're all coming in from, what your backgrounds are, what your roles are, but you're all culture carriers if you're here today joining a CultureCon talk and looking to learn more. So I personally am looking forward to this conversation, to learning more about all of you. As I said, I'm one of the co-founders of Kunik, and I started Kunik because I truly wanted to help employers build the type of workplace that I personally always wanted and couldn't find in my past careers. And that's an empathetic, growth-minded culture where you could have exactly the type of conversation we're about to have right now. So I would love to hear what brought you guys in as you have time to share throughout. And we're going to do some polls to learn a little more about you too. But I think the fact that each of you is here today to talk about stress and burnout and really how it's impacting the workplace is honestly pretty special and telling given the times that we're in right now. We believe at Kunik that there's tremendous power in bringing people together so that we can learn from each other. Our aim is to make work more human. And to date, I have yet to find a way to do that beyond talking with each other and learning from each other. So we use the power of conversation to engage and connect each of you and employees with each other and with the company at large so that you can grow and develop together. Whether that's working with ERGs, working with managers, thinking about team cohesion, or addressing kind of the topics that touch everybody, like this one, like stress and burnout, our aim is always the same. We tailor our programs and conversations to meet your challenges, your needs, and your goals, and to create intentional moments of connection, learning, and growth, like the one we're about to experience here today. So if you're somebody on this call who's thinking about culture, who's thinking about what learning looks like in the future of work, who's thinking about how to develop and share and grow, we'd be happy to talk with you anytime. And we're very grateful for you for being here today. So Zach, I know we have a poll to learn a little bit more about how everybody on the call is thinking about stress and burnout, what that looks like for you and your organization. Kate, we are so grateful for you for joining us and excited to learn from you and what I know is going to be a powerful look at these drivers of stress and burnout in the workplace today. So Zach, is that poll up or can we put that up? Perfect.
Just launched it. Yep.
Awesome. Oh, you know what? And we actually, sorry about this, guys. We have 5 questions on here. 3 of the bottom 3 were supposed to be later on, but you know what? You can answer them all now, and Kate and I will just look back at that data as we get further in. So now you've got a sneak peek behind the curtain at what's coming and what we're talking about. But if you all can just take one moment and fill this out, that will be very helpful. Kate, it almost looks like you're wearing the exact same thing you are in your photo on there.
You know what? My mum told me when I was little that navy looked good on me, and I have many a navy elements in my. This one's got puffy sleeves. That one's a jumpsuit.
That's true. You're right. It's hard to tell though. The shoulders are cut off.
Shoulders are very similar.
You can't see it all.
I dressed like my profile picture to make sure no one was confused at who was speaking.
No impersonators. Can never be too cautious these days. Awesome. We'll give you guys just another minute. And then Kate, as soon as we're done with the poll, Zach, feel free to end whenever we've got enough answers in there. And Kate, we'll pass it to you to teach us all so we can learn from your wisdom.
I'm just currently singing a whole multitude of songs, Liz. I've got like Beautiful Day, Pocket of Sunshine.
Kate, you've been part of the Kunik team for long enough. I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Who do you think designed that poll with the songs?
Was that Cam?
It sure was.
Yeah. He's so good.
You win.
So good with some music.
I know.
All right. I am just going to jump in and do a little bit of an introduction about why this topic mattered to me. So hi, I'm Kate Snowise. I am from New Zealand originally, if you're wondering where the accent is from. And if you jumped on early enough in the call, you may have heard Liz and I talking. Currently live in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, on the St. Paul side of the river, if it matters to any of you. But I did my research into stress and burnout when I was training as an industrial and organizational psychologist back in New Zealand in the mid-2000s. And I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I came out of my program and was adamant that I was going to solve this issue of stress in the world, because I thought it was one of the things that was contributing to so many of us going sort of bat crap crazy, as I like to put it. And I launched into the workforce mid 2000s, and there wasn't an organization that wanted to have this conversation nor pay to really be thinking about their employee stress and well-being. And it was very much seen as an individual issue. And so one thing I will say is that I am so grateful to be sitting here in 2022 and be in the situation where people actually are willing to have this conversation now and want to learn more about what we can do to support ourselves and our people. So that's a little bit about me. But coming around to this topic of burnout, it only makes sense if we have a solid understanding of stress. And I think what I'm noticing in the current culture is there's a lot of the, we're so burned out, everyone's burned out, but there isn't a lot of discussion around, well, where did we get, how do we get to this point? And stress and understanding the stress process is vital to understanding burnout. And so, trained as a psychologist, I very much look at this from a psychological model. So less of that physiological model and some of the deep breathing and calming our nervous system, and a lot more about how are our people feeling and what are the emotional tolls that they are experiencing. The model I'm using here is based off the transactional model of stress and coping, also sometimes called the cognitive appraisal model of stress and coping. So I will say I didn't make it up, but what I did do is put some language to it to make it a little bit more practical. But one of the things that I think is really vital that we are not talking enough about is that stress is an outcome measure. We end up stressed, but there is so much that happens in the process before we get to that point of being stressed out, overwhelmed, or ultimately burned out. And it all starts with our exposure to pressure. And so pressure is the input. You can think of that as a stressor or a demand, but that is what starts off the stress process. And it is recognizing that this is the beginning that allows us to talk about what we can do between our exposure to pressure and potentially ending up stressed. It's in that space that we have the ability to influence both our own lives, but also the organizations that our people are working in. So we're exposed to pressure and the whole stress cycle kicks off. The next thing that happens is when an individual meets pressure, the very first thing that happens is it goes through this filter of mindset, or what I like to frame as mindset. This is often completely unconscious, but it is those sort of visceral and automatic feelings of, can I cope with this? And if any part of our system thinks, you know what, I'm not sure I can cope with this, this is incredibly overwhelming, we actually bounce straight to stressed, or that stress response. And we're going to be talking more about what this means at an organizational level. But mindset is this vital first element that we need to be thinking about when it comes to our exposure to pressure. From there, we have a couple more coping pathways that also open up to us. So we hit that mindset pressure, and if we either have to cope with it, we might still be feeling that stress, but we will pull on our coping resources. What can we do to take care of it? And there are action-based strategies which fall into what is called problem-focused coping. And these strategies deal directly with the pressure we're experiencing. So action-based strategies are trying to manage, mitigate, or reduce that pressure directly. Like, I like to think of like pressure like a giant haystack. I don't know why I see it as a haystack in my head, but as a haystack, and the idea being that like an action-based strategy is trying to make that haystack smaller, make our pressure pile smaller. Now, the other coping resource that we have available to us is around re-energizing. And we're going to talk more about this today, those nourishment-based strategies that they don't deal with the pressure directly, They're about dealing with the emotional impacts and the energy required to mobilize ourselves to deal with that pressure. So whereas action-based strategies nip the stress in the bud, nourishment-based strategies or self-care oriented strategies are trying to deal with the effects of stress and minimize them. It's about building up our tolerance, making us hardier or more resilient. And these are really the three pathways that we have available to us to intersect with that stress process and mediate it so that between pressure and the outcome, we can actually go through this whole process and come out the other side thriving. As I like to say to people, bring to mind some of your greatest accomplishments in life. And people typically will mention their children. And I will be like, it's incredibly stressful, right? Being a parent, if anyone knows it out there, and by all means, pop it in the chat bar if you know what I'm talking about. But it is incredibly stressful at times to parent, yet at the same time, it is deeply meaningful. And so stress and accomplishment and thriving in life, they're all very interwoven. But what we want to avoid is sort of those unhappy effects, the psychological impacts that really pull us down into that place of overwhelm and burnout. And I think it's important to sort of differentiate between the two. You know, stress is an in the moment sort of occurrence, whereas burnout is the prolonged exposure to pressure that has not been adequately managed. So burnout is what happens when the stress has been weighing heavy on us for too long and we have gone through all of our coping resources. I often say, like, when we feel like we're scraping from the bottom of the barrel. So the World Health Organization has, ironically enough, they said that burnout was an actual legitimate thing. I think it was about 2018, maybe even 2019, right before the COVID pandemic hit. And they have defined it as a workplace phenomenon, which I would push against and say you can be outside of the workplace and still experience burnout, you know, as stay-at-home parents and other things like that. But these are the types of behaviors or indicators that you might notice in yourself and others that may suggest that you are getting to that point of burnout. So there's the cynicism, which often shows up as a lack of hope, potentially a negative disposition, snappy, a little bit not yourself, and heightened emotionality. One of the ones that people often don't think about so much is the reduced confidence. And it's a real tragedy of the burnout process. But what happens if you are feeling overwhelmed by stress for a prolonged period of time is it starts to eat away at your mindset. And so this is a naturally protective mechanism. The more pressure you then experience, you will hit that mindset filter and your systems are going into this absolutely not, we cannot deal with anything else. And so even challenges that you may have previously found easy or very manageable start to become overwhelming. And that's what people don't often realize is that you might be nervous or feel anxiety about projects that you've already successfully completed or things that you've already previously done. But it also shows up as nervousness about new challenges and maybe even feelings of failure, like you're not doing a good job. And then the one that I think we are most familiar with and how burnout sort of is spoken about in more of a cliche term is around this exhaustion component. So there's the lethargy, the lack of motivation, the reduction in your productivity, and potentially that social withdrawal or pulling back from people. The reason we sort of had that you didn't think of here, and when we were in that culture con session, we opened it up to a bit of conversation here, and it was so interesting because what I don't think people always think about is that if someone is showing up to you and they are not their natural selves, it doesn't always look like tears and exhaustion. It may look like frustration. It may look like being very short and impatient. And we had this sort of pause in that room at that time to say, you need to be sort of really aware as leaders in an organization if people are changing their behavior or it's not within their normal character. Rather than jumping to conclusions, possibly stepping back and being curious to really understand what is happening with your people, because burnout doesn't always show up in the kind of ways that we may be expecting. So this was the shared understanding that is absolutely essential to when we're talking about how do we beat back burnout. These are the ways that we can mediate the stress process. And in mediating the stress process, that's where we have the power to take a holistic approach to our well-being and the well-being of our people within an organization. So it's not just one strategy that I would encourage you to contemplate, but it needs to be a consideration of all of these coping pathways and really considering how, as an organization or an individual, you are paying attention to every single one. So just to reiterate what they are, an action-based focus is really around that problem-focused coping. And problem-focused coping is about dealing with the pressure directly and reducing the pressure that your people are experiencing. And in truth, organizations often have a lot of control over the amount of pressure their people are experiencing. Now, mindset, when we're talking about an individual level compared to an organizational level, it's a little bit different. And building on what Liz was saying, ultimately an organizational mindset is really more about the culture or experience we're having from an environment. Does that environment lead us to feel safe, supported, and empowered? Because if we're talking about the experience of dealing with pressure, we all feel more capable and that we can deal with more if we feel like we're not in it alone. If we have teamwork and people that we know are supporting us, we feel that much more capable. And so culture is an essential element of mediating the stress process and creating sustainable working environments. And then finally, we have the nourishment-based strategies. That is where we're talking about the emotion-focused coping, the self-care, the renourishing our energy. And that's where it's actually much more individually focused. We can't, as an organization, go out and say to our people, I need you to work out 5 times a week, make sure you eat really well, go to bed every night at 9 p.m. and have a solid routine to make sure that you're getting into a good sleep zone. I mean, that's where we're going into the border of like, that is personal. And there's actually a lot less organizational power or ability to impact the nourishment-based strategies, which are far more personal and individually focused. So any questions at this point, please just throw them in the chat bar. I can see the chat bar, but I do want this to be as conversational as we can make it in the webinar format. I'll leave this slide up and take a little break. I always say to people when we're at this point in the presentation, I'm like, this gives me a chance to have a little bit of a sip of water. So please, if there are things that you're like, okay, Kate, just to make sense of this, please throw it in there, because if you're thinking it, someone else probably is too. I can see the chat and say, yeah, Nick, I was just talking about how much I appreciated medicine when I was there. What are some ways that companies can influence on the nourishment portion? We're going to talk about that. And in fact, I think, to be honest, moving into our next slide, that is where organizations have typically, in my experience, been putting a ton of their effort, because that's the way we're talking about the stress process. So my hope in sort of digging in a little bit deeper here is that we're not just talking about nourishment, because nourishment really is what people do more on their own time to re-energize and restore. And I don't think as organizations we're talking enough about the cultures and mindsets we're creating and how we can reduce the pressure our people are experiencing. What about adjusting to new teams and burnout? These are individuals that you don't know their normal behavior. Yeah, that's a really, really great call. That's a hard one, right? When you don't have a baseline to necessarily be able to understand what is outside of one's normal character. What I would say in that circumstance is curiosity is always a great way to start as a leader, that understanding before accusing. And I know that just sounds really simple, but seeking to understand another human and going back to making our workplaces more humanistic, more human focused, recognizing that we have a human sitting in front of us and understanding why they're reacting the way they do can go a long way. And also understanding as leaders how you can support them, because people will often tell you if you ask. All righty. So I'm going to jump in here, and this is where we had our poll and our questions. I don't know if we can bring back the poll a little bit. Is this where we had it, Liz? You can jump in and
This is exactly where we had it, Kate. So Zach, I don't know if you want to launch it again. It's those kind of bottom 3 questions, or if you have the results that you can share, but it's talking about where we're currently investing and what that looks like. There we go. All right, Kate, can you see that?
Perfect. I can see that. So scroll
Excellent.
down. Hopefully the poll is in front of you, and now we are looking at the results. What are we currently doing and where are we currently spending our dollars? I think this is what we're talking about here. And when we're talking about beating back burnout from an organizational perspective, what are the types of things we are doing? I love this because we actually have some stats from this group here. So what we've got: self-care, mindfulness apps, fitness apps, employee assistance programs. It's interesting to see that there's this sort of like this balance across. What is obviously streaking ahead here is the financial benefits, which when we're talking about nourishment, if you give a financial benefit, salary finance, it's interesting in that I would argue it doesn't necessarily reduce stress that much. It is something that is appreciated one time and then evaporates. And that is an interesting conversation in and of itself. We also, mindset matters. We're going to be moving into this, but we're currently investing in building culture of psychological safety, high five, upskilling managers to build inclusive teams. Perfect. And then finally, the last question, we're currently taking the following actions: improving processes, building work agreements, reviewing and improving workflows, establishing communication platforms, and enabling continued learning and peer conversations. We're going to be continuing to talk about these, and I would like to revisit this at the end because I think it'll make more sense in context as we continue through. But what we have noticed at Kunik, and what I have noticed in my work in this field for many years, is that typically what I see is that people are still, when we're talking about dealing with stress and burnout, they're still putting their money here in meditation, gyms, EAP, perks that very much fall into what I would frame, as we were just talking about, that nourishment or individually focused type bucket. And the danger is with only looking at that one element is that you're not necessarily going to see the organizational impact in a reduction of stress in the way you might hope. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But that same money invested in these sort of broader things can often make more of an impact in terms of how your people feel about coming to work. Do they feel supported? And do they feel like their stress levels are being actively mitigated against by reducing pressure? And that's really what we wanted to highlight here, is that taking this kind of fruit basket and gym membership approach is really only looking at one element of a three-part process, and arguably is the area where you can have the least impact, because you're passing it over to the individual and asking them to manage their well-being themselves. And we've chuckled about how the fact that I sometimes have a bit of a problem with words like, can you come and help us build stamina and resilience within our team? And the flip side to that question is, are we creating individuals to deal with a rough and tough environment, or do we want to create a workplace that is sustainable, where people don't need to be building their own individual stamina and resilience to be able to deal with it? And that's really the crux of the issue here.
Kate, can I stop you there for 1 second? Because
Yeah.
I would love in the chat, for some reason I can only message the host and panelists, so sorry everyone, but I would love to hear from all of you in the chat. Kate, I think it's a great point that you've brought up before, which is that resilience really puts the burden on the individual rather than on kind of the structural issues that we're seeing. And so we don't have an alternative word, as you and I often joke about, for resilience yet, but we'd love to hear from all of you in the chat your thoughts on kind of that take on resilience. Is it time to retire the word resilience? Is there another word you'd use instead? And what do you think about that? So I toss that out there to everyone, and thanks for raising that point, Kate. I think it's very well made.
Yeah, I would love to have like a chat discussion about this, and to have any of you thought about this? What does resilience imply? I feel like we need some elevator music at this point, Liz. Like one of those
This is
songs.
Cam. I'm telling
I'm
you,
like one of
Cam
those
is our
songs that
music guy.
Cam had at the beginning.
Exactly. Oh, see, no, that would have been good if that was the track throughout. That would have been next level.
Just that little
Next
drop
time.
of sunshine. Was that Natasha Bedingfield he had?
I think so. I think so. I'll let you keep going, but if anybody has thoughts on resilience and kind of that throughout, as you can tell, Kate and I are not shy about waiting through the pause, so we're always happy to hear.
Can you repeat the question? So basically, in terms of Carly, it's the concept of whether or not we are looking at this from an individual perspective and expecting our people to be resilient, to have high levels of stamina, to be like emotionally tough, or whether we are looking at it from the elements that as an organization we can impact, which are the environment that we're bringing them to and the pressure we are exposing them to. So this is called the transactional model of stress. The idea being it's a transaction between a person and their environment. A lot of the way we have been dealing with stress and burnout is putting, in my opinion, too much of an individual onus on the employees or the individual to toughen up to deal with a workplace or to deal with the stress, and still not enough responsibility on the organization to create and be mitigating the pressure that people are experiencing in the workplace. So hopefully that clarifies it a little bit more. And by all means, you can let us know your feelings for the words resilience. And if you have an aversion to it, like I do. You know, I did hear stamina the other day though, Liz, and I was like, you know what, stamina I might like even less than resilience. So I'm not saying that it's not this beautiful marriage between those two elements. What I'm saying is, from an organizational perspective, we need to be looking at where we can have the greatest influence. And what we find is that you might be doing all of those things. And I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I'm not saying, you know, go and get rid of your EAP and get rid of your gym memberships and your fruit bowl. They're all important, but it is only one part of what we propose as a three-part process. The thing is, with putting the onus on the sort of nourishment-based strategies to help build that sense of resilience within your people, is that so often people don't take you up on it. People aren't using those self-care based initiatives to regenerate, restore, and re-energize. And in a room full of people, I will often get people to sheepishly put up their hands at this point and say, like, how many of you know all of the ideas around self-care and what you could be doing? And, you know, most of the room put up their hand. And then how many of you are actually doing it? And very few people put up their hand all over again. And the thing is that when we're looking at the way our mechanisms have been sort of set up, we're not built to deal with the type of stress that we are now dealing with in workplaces. So our alarm and alert systems are built to deal with acute stresses. So there's the lion chasing us, and we're running away. And yet once we have escaped, we have this inbuilt time just in the routines and rhythms of our daily lives that once we have gone through that acute stress, we are naturally going to rest and restore or move into our nourishment and restoration systems. But we are not dealing with acute stresses today. We're really dealing with chronic stresses. And the problem is with chronic stress, and let's take technology as an example, it never leaves you alone. And our systems, especially when we get caught into the stress kind of circuitry, if we perceive there is threat in our environment, if we perceive there is something we need to take care of because it is stressing us out, we will be naturally oriented towards taking care of that. And so we're not built to work, rest, work, rest, work, rest. If there is chronic stress dripping in, that chronic pressure dripping in at the start of that stress process, our natural go-to is to orient ourselves towards it. And so we typically will just fall off the cliff, right? We'll end up in some maladaptive coping habits to deal with the pressure, less of the sort of proactive thing and in terms of utilizing self-care strategies, which is actually very typical of our programming. So while you might be putting your energy here as an organization, I'd be surprised at what kind of uptake you might have and whether or not it's the best way to spend your money. All right, so a couple of things that have popped up in the chat bar. Resilience can be a dangerous word in that it puts the onus back on the employee and doesn't allow for the company to take accountability. That's exactly what I am saying. Thank you, Isis, for putting that in your words. That's exactly what we're talking about here. The danger of putting too much onus and not enough responsibility on the organization. Yes, absolutely, Michelle. I often will talk about it as organizational resilience versus individual resilience. And when I do, frame things as building resilience, I do use those kind of differences that go such a long way. Shared resilience, organizational resilience, that really do differentiate it. And would some leaders conflate reducing pressure with being less aggressive about business goals or not holding people accountable for meeting objectives? Yeah, this is a really important point, and I'm glad that you have brought it up. It's obviously there's this tension with productivity. And this really comes down to the cultures you want to create in your workplaces and what are the senior leadership, where do they buy in? And do they see the benefit in not pushing people too far into what I call the red zone? So I like to think of it a little bit like if we all have a dashboard on our well-being, we can all be pushed outside of our natural stress tolerance for a short period of time. And actually, sometimes when I'm talking about thriving, as long as we don't stay out there, it's often when we will reach some of our greatest accomplishments. So short bursts of, intensive periods. As an example, I heard one organization I worked with were talking about when they had to pivot during COVID to working from home and finding all new ways of doing things. People were stretched. But what that organization found, and their people confessed to me in our workshop, was that once the senior leadership had seen that they could work like that, they thought that was a sustainable place for their people to continue to work. They did amazing things in a short period of time. And rather than being that was a stretch period and that was unrealistic to continue to put that amount of pressure on our people, they started to burn out their team. And then obviously we get other issues that massively impact productivity around, turnover and all of these other sorts of things. So I think that is a tension that needs to be discussed, and there needs to be a strong business case. And there are the statistics that demonstrate that you do get a reduction in productivity once you stretch people too far. And it's a fairly major reduction in productivity. I want to say in the realm of 20 to 30%. can't remember off the top of my head, but there are statistics to make that business case that, burning your team out by putting them under too much pressure is not actually good for that bottom line. So what can we do? As we have been talking about the impacts of where does our power lie as organizational leaders? And one of the most important things we can think about that can, I guess, feel a little bit more tenuous in terms of the relationship, right? So we've all been told that if we work out, we're going to stress less. And it's a little bit harder to understand maybe those linkages between the importance of creating an empowered mindset within our groups, within our teams, within our organizations. But it is those environments that are really going to contribute to your people being able to deal with that much more. It is things like, as we had in this list, creating psychologically safe environments, creating empathetic listening and ensuring your people feel heard, creating courageous conversations and making sure that people have the places to express some of the unique pressures they experience through DE&I and other employee resource groups. To have strong teams with work contracts that trust and impactful leaders. And we all know this, that leadership is essential, but leaders are often the people that inadvertently burn out their team by expectations. And so having excellent leaders is a huge part of creating sustainable work environments. So we had a little quick point here. Now that we're sort of talking about this, and I'm getting a sense that there is some understanding of what we're highlighting here, what do you think your organizations are doing well to create empowered and supportive environments? I would love to share, sort of pull some ideas. What are you doing that you think, hey, you know what, we're doing a good job here? It's where I need my whole music, Liz.
Exactly. We need our Jeopardy music, our whole music. And listen, if it's something that you don't know necessarily across your entire organization, but there's something, sorry to start with my cameras off. If there's something you think you're doing well on your team, a manager is doing well, it doesn't have to be, the entire company. Or even something maybe that you learned from somebody else. If you were somebody who attended CultureCon and you heard from somebody else something they're doing, we'd, love to hear anything along those lines.
Love that. Regular check-ins and an open door to HR to help people work through challenges. It's huge. And this is what I mean. We don't want to be overlooking these kind of elements and how they're contributing to reduce burnout within our organizations. Any other ideas or a leader that you've worked with that's done a great job? Every manager is empowered to do whatever they need to do for their staff. Huge. Right? Giving those people leaders the power and the leeway to make decisions that are going to support their team. Strategic ways employees can encourage senior leadership to simplify or think about culture or push to make it even more relatable to the average employee. Do you have thoughts on strategic ways employees? Employees, that's an interesting one, when we're talking up. Obviously what we're proposing here, Katie, and what I think is so useful about this model is it can be a really simplistic framework to be able to try and communicate your ideas and what it takes to make a holistic approach to organizational well-being. And so when we're talking about influencing senior leaders, I think the simpler you can be, the more powerful you will be. And so that's one of the reasons that I find this model really useful to just break down. I don't know if others have experienced that sort of discussion around burnout, as it's sort of take 5 deep breaths over here while going and eating right over here. And it's all very sort of ad hoc. And for me, the unifying frameworks are essential and influencing.
To that end too, Kate, the other thing, and to you, Katie, the other thing I would add in is when we think about going through an organization and kind of driving shift and change org-wide, we tend to think about it in pyramids. So you start with your senior leaders, you've got managers, and then you've got teams and ICs down below. We tend to think about that middle, the managers a lot, whether they're mid-level managers, new managers. They're interesting because they go up to senior leaders, down to ICs. They kind of connect across all the dots. So our general recommendation is within that core, try and find who your advocates and allies are. So don't try and convince the people who aren't convinced yet. Don't try and convince people who, maybe are all stamina and resilience and spend, all their time thinking about how each individual has to overcome it. Get the people who say, yeah, we've got an org-wide issue here. Find your allies, build from that manager trunk, push up towards senior leaders first, and then trickle down to ICs. We found to be pretty effective in terms of driving that change. And I also think a lot of times something that companies kind of overlook, forget, or don't turn back to are their culture and their values. And a lot of times that's just either listed on a website, it's put on a board that sits somewhere in a cafeteria, but breathing those values, those corporate values and different ways to think about them, breathing them to life through chats with fireside chats. You bring in a Kate and you do a fireside chat, not with your CEO, but maybe with somebody people don't hear from a lot, but who's an advocate of this kind of change in the workplace. And that helps breathe those values to life and trickle it down too.
Super powerful points. Thanks for jumping in, Liz. So, yeah, you're welcome, Katie. I love it. I can see the chat, but I can't see your faces. In terms of, that idea, as I was saying, of where is our impact as organizational leaders? Where is our impact when we're talking about collective well-being? And coming back to this concept of it's a transaction, stress and burnout is a transaction between a person and their environment. And considering the environment you're putting them into, one part of that when we're talking about mindset and perspective is very much the culture of support that you create. And there are many ways you can contribute to that, but I hope that you're understanding the importance of seeing that as an element that is essential in a well-rounded well-being plan. The other element that is also essential is this action-based strategies. This is where we're talking about problem-focused coping. How do we take that pressure pile and help reduce it to a sustainable level that can create ongoing performance? There are absolutely things we can do as an individual. This is where this kind of becomes a little bit more of a crossover. There are individual things we can do. How do we build better boundaries at an individual level? And how can we support our people to do so? How do we prioritize and manage our time? And what are our actions and habits that we are leaning into as individuals? And do they support us? So I'm not going to lie, my first job, not my first job, but my second, I went through a time management based course. And I know this sounds super old school. And this is one of the trends I have seen, that things like time management and prioritization aren't quite as cool as they were in the mid 2000s. And we're talking more about self-care and nourishing, but learning how to organize my time and my approach to how I did my work is something that has helped me no end in my ongoing career and how I show up. And that has definitely impacted my own stress levels. So I think it's about just bringing these things back to the fore and realizing the power that lies in supporting our people to better manage, mitigate, or reduce the pressure they're experiencing directly. And reducing the pressure together. When I did do my research, some of the greatest stress came from interpersonal relationships in workplaces. And if we've worked in a workplace long enough, you will know what I'm talking about. How do we navigate difficult conversations? How can we apply emotional intelligence and have that interpersonal effectiveness? How do we deal with feedback better? And how can we, from more of a practical point of view, so that's the relationship focus and that relationship pressure. But when we're talking about how do we structure the way we are doing our work, there is so much power to be had in tightening up these ideas and processes. So how are we conducting meetings? And what do our workflows look like? All things that we can be considering when we're taking this more holistic view to managing burnout in our organizations. So, I mean, we just had another little chat point here. Oh, I see there's some chat things have come in. Liz, do you want to jump in and read out some of these chat elements?
Yeah, I'd love to. There's some great stuff coming in. Michelle, Dee, I know you're both talking about culture champions and kind of culture carrier roles, which I think goes back to a point that Angela had made earlier on check-ins and open doors. And, I would say awesome. Congratulations on the culture champion team, Michelle. It's definitely a trend we're seeing in a lot of our work with employee resource groups is moving to inclusion councils and culture champions. We're also seeing people do employee experience champion networks, trying to pull information, gather, connect thoughts across broader organizations, especially I can see you said 30 plus offices. So connecting across remote and distributed teams for sure is a big part of that. Dee, in terms of the culture carrier roles, and Kate or Nick or Zach as well, welcome your thoughts here. It's true. It's not a side hustle. It does need to be treated as kind of a full-time, full part of the organization, which can be a real challenge to Katie's earlier point in terms of getting that executive level buy-in. But I think that's where starting with culture councils, culture champions is a way, not as a side hustle necessarily, but a way to kind of crowdsource and work together to spread that throughout the organization. So great points, Michelle, Dee, Katie, Angela, everybody who's been chiming in. Thank you for sharing. Kate, of course, any other ideas you have there, would love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation we're having here is really important. And as we said at the beginning, you are the culture leaders that's why you are part of the CultureCon community. And I'm sure you can feel from Liz and I, our passion lies in continuing to put the pressure on organizations throughout the world to be more humanistic. How can we stop looking at our people merely as human resources and create sustainable workplaces? And I do believe that the COVID pandemic contributed to us hastening this conversation, which I think is a good thing, but we're still looking for the solutions. And as many of us as culture leaders, I'm sure, understand, these are the solutions, but it is about really finding the ways to have that heard and understood. In terms of this kind of concept, and again, love would be great to just crowdsource, because I believe there's so much power in learning from one another rather than us just sitting here and giving you ideas. What strategies have you noticed in your team, your organization, or with leaders you have worked with that have been used to actively reduce the pressure that you or the people around you are experiencing? I would love to hear what you have heard work. Like I said, I know it sounds not that cool, but that time management training I did had a huge impact on my career and my own pressure levels. I'm not naturally organized, and I needed that. So any other ideas about how we can actively reduce the pressure our people experience? Or any other ideas that are coming up or thoughts, by all means, drop them in the chat.
One question while you all are adding in there that came up earlier, and I know you addressed it a little bit, Kate, is that kind of new to a team, which is a great one, because especially right now, we're seeing a lot of people move around, shift roles, even within one company or externally to other organizations. And I think three things that I think about around that are managers, for sure, play a huge role in that, in terms of thinking about how to check in on their people, how to build cohesion across their team, how to connect, to your point, as humans, not just on work, but then of course, things like workflows, work structures, communication norms. We found that teams that have clearer expectations, clearer outlines, clear established norms throughout it, there is less stress and burnout, because people know what to expect. And like it or not, humans are creatures of habit. And so when we have clear guidelines and expectations, it helps reduce stress, because we know what we're working towards, how we're getting there, and how we're collaborating. That gets into obviously a lot of bigger picture things around how do we measure performance? What does that actually look like? How do we think about collaboration and not just individual output, which again goes back to managers. But I think that clarity is a big piece. And then I also think one that's not in here, but is important as we think about people moving across organizations today, is onboarding and how we transfer culture and not just knowledge. And I think a lot of onboarding is focused on knowledge transfer and not culture transfer. And so it goes, to the points that we've had in here from Michelle and Dee and others, is How can we, what are culture carriers, culture champions? How do we think about that when we think about new talent coming in the door is something that I would pose back to all of you as well. And I see some things coming in here for sure. Remote work is difficult to connect as humans. I think a lot of this, Dee, honestly, is bringing people together for conversations. This is tougher when people are in chat, but when people can actually share, where they feel valued, seen, and heard across a range of topics that address different identities and different lived experiences, from learning and development side to the DEI side. Awesome, Angela. Internal coaching of people managers to help them with conversations. Yeah, absolutely a big one.
These are like phenomenal ideas, and we just really hope that this conversation has helped you to really consider burnout and well-being from a slightly different view, and to really leave you, was our hope, with 3 questions that I hope you can take back and start exploring. And these same 3 questions you can take back and start exploring on a personal level, obviously with a couple of tweaks. But these are the questions that are powerful to take back and explore at an organizational level, because as we're seeing through this conversation, no one environment nor one organization necessarily is going to need the exact same thing. And it takes this willingness to explore in these particular areas between the exposure to pressure and the outcome of people feeling stressed and burned out. That's where we have the power to make a difference in this process. And these are 3 pathways that can help us take a really holistic view. So we've got 3 questions for you. In terms of that, like, mindset or culture, what can we do to directly, it's the wrong question. So my bad, team, we've got the wrong question there. The mindset question really is, what can we do to create a supportive and empowered environment? So we will type that in the chat bar. What can we do to create a supportive and empowered environment? What can we do to directly reduce the pressure our people experience? And what can we do to support our people to restore and re-energize? There's some stuff popping into the chat here just as we wrap up. Like, we conduct a lot of video calls. Almost every conversation is a video chat. The majority of our workforce are remote, and it's worked for us thus far. What can we do to create a supportive environment? Thanks, Liz. And appreciation activities, absolutely. Like, Dee, absolutely. Appreciation activities, and we were just talking about, like, I had an executive coaching call right before this call, and he said, how do I make my sales meetings more enjoyable, Kate? And we sort of brainstormed some ideas, and like I said, it's not one size fits all. It's about stepping back and exploring that. How do we make our sales calls more enjoyable? And we actually came up with a little bit of a strategy that he's going to try out of coming back to where we started this conversation, Liz. He's going to have each of his team members come every Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. with a song to start them off for the week, a rah-rah song. Because he confessed to me the week before last, he loves heavy metal. And it is about, like, how can we bring lightness and excitement and fun into the workplace as well. I'm going to hand over to you, Liz, just to close us out.
Sure. I love seeing all of this coming into the chat. Absolutely. Please feel free to keep adding in there. Kate, thank you so much for all of this wisdom and knowledge. I hope you all have learned. I would love to see also if there's anything you're taking away from this conversation, anything that really resonated with you. Please feel free to add that in the chat. I always love to see what stood out, what people are walking away with, or if you want to offer a witness round, which is, repeating something you heard from Kate that you found valuable, we'd appreciate that as well. So thank you for being here. I know we've got 2 minutes left. Thank you to the CultureCon team. We are big fans of CultureCon. We're there. We'll be going back. We hope to see all of you there. This on the screen right here is just a little bit about kind of how, if you've enjoyed this conversation, if some of you mentioned, how do you keep a remote team together? That's a lot of the work that we do at Kunik. We work with hybrid, remote, and in-person teams. We work on upskilling, learning, and connection. Everything we do is driven on engagement and practical, actionable tips and tools. This on the screen on the left-hand side, Kate does a phenomenal deep dive into this topic. It can be done across an organization or within a team. And if you're looking to kind of expand beyond stress and burnout, but want to think across other elements, not another meeting, listening, psych safety, how to navigate difficult conversations, mental agility and fitness, all topics that I think I saw coming up throughout the chat, kind of thinking about how do we keep people together? How do you make a meeting fun, to your point, Kate? How do you equip managers to navigate difficult conversations? I saw in the chat. We'd love to share what we've learned, offer you worksheets, guides, anything that's going to be helpful. We very much view this as a community, and kind of rising tide lifts all boats. So we're always happy to talk. My partner Josh's email is on the bottom there, but I'll add it in here. And we will get you all out of here at 1 minute to go, because I'm sure everybody's jumping to other meetings as everybody lives in a back-to-back world these days. So thank you, everyone.